gather myself here while bits and pieces of paper are being passed around. Liam, are you listening in?
Hi, Commissioner, yes, I am.
Yeah, Liam, a couple of things. We understand that Richard's not available tomorrow.
That's correct.
And won't have access. So somehow or another, we need to talk to both Richard and Glenn together, like we've done with the other witnesses. And I think we'll just see how we go towards. They'll come on after we've got a couple of witnesses, I think, and then it's over to you. But we'll certainly want to get through Richard and Glenn today. So if we can work together to achieve that.
Yeah, so I agree that's a good approach to be able to question them both at the same time. We circulated a summary statement for Richard, but Mr. Connolly's summary isn't available yet, and I think it would be, he is available to answer questions this afternoon alongside Richard, but I think it would be also more effective if he presented his summary and also be available to answer his own questions specifically for him tomorrow in person, because he would be there.
Okay. No, that's good. So let's get questions at for both Glenn and Richard this afternoon, and then we'll hear in detail from Glenn tomorrow morning. Okay. So
thank you, sir.
A second point: do you have legal submissions, Liam, or
not? Yes, I'll be lodging them at 3 p.m. today.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. We'll look out for those. Thank you. Right, we're going to go through your bundle of information. Yes, thanks.
Yes, so these supplementary submissions really just deal with a couple of small matters that were raised during the course of the hearing yesterday that there were questions requesting further detail on. So I'll just go through those and then we'll take you through in the relevant parts the attachments to these submissions as well. So firstly, on section 74, the hearing panel sought clarification as to the statutory basis for the consideration, in particular of non-statutory documents, and listed 2.1 those the MUGs, the draft plan, as well as various government policy statements, including Route to Zero strategy as part of that. So section 74(2)(b)(1 requires the hearing panel to have regard to management plans and strategies prepared under other acts. So that, from comments yesterday, we had understood that MUGS was produced under the LGA, although having not been approved or accepted or adopted by the council. I think there was, and I may have had that wrong, but Ms. Barr, I think this morning said it wasn't formally produced under the LGA. In any event, in our submission, any strategy that the council is commissioning has to have been under the LGA or the RMA in some shape or form, whether it's gone through all of the necessary steps as far as acceptance and adoption is a different point.
Yes. Daniel, I think the clarification was, I asked whether it had gone through an LGA consultation formal process, and she said it hadn't. So,
and certainly we don't dispute that.
Yes. Okay. No, so that's helpful.
Also refer to what Kotahi's Road to Zero strategy equally falling under that same provision. Even where a document does not fall under one of those listed within section 74, there are examples of the Environment Court considering other non-statutory documents. I give a quote there from the court where it simply outlines that it would be odd to simply ignore it, and you'll see various cases that I've referenced as far as precedent for the consideration of non-statutory documents in terms of a threshold of whether they can be considered or not. The weight is quite a separate question.
Yes.
And SART 2.5 outlined that each of these documents can lawfully be considered by you and appropriate weight given to them as you see fit. And we, in my open submission, addressed that question of weight. One other matter on weight that arose, for example, through questioning of Mr. Heath and then subsequently some comments from Ms. Barr yesterday. there were, in my submission in relation to mugs, we do wish to reiterate that it is the combined effect of mugs and the draft district plan that show a consistent direction of travel in terms of urban growth and planning. And so I think there was a comment by Ms. Barr yesterday to suggest that mugs may not have been advanced because of a subsequent change in approach by the council, and I think she's going to come back to us all on that. From my submission, even if mugs as a whole hasn't been taken forward due to some change of approach, there is still consistency in relation to this site, in that there isn't a suggestion that we aren't holding mugs out where it is an outlier document in relation to the future direction of growth in relation to that area north of Kashmir Oaks. And so that is why we think that mugs and the draft district plan together do have absolute relevance to you, and they can be relied on in demonstrating, as we've outlined in our opening submissions, that this has been long signalled that growth would potentially occur in this area. You also saw in the Mr. Georgeson take you to the attachment to Ms. St. Aman's evidence that, again, that was another document going back 14 years that again had this area identified for growth. So that's part of our broader submission, that rezoning and the urbanisation of this area is not a surprise, in the sense that it has been long signalled through various documents, including mugs, including the draft district plan. The second point, there was a question yesterday from Commissioner McMahon regarding relevant objective or objectives for the purposes of section 32. And just to complete the picture on that, draw your attention to section 32.3. That requires, when you're looking at a change to a plan, that the section 32 evaluation relates to both the provisions and objectives of the plan change and the existing district plan objectives to the extent they're relevant and would remain unchanged. We are proposing changes to the district plan objectives. Mr. Lewandowski took you yesterday to that key residential objective. And on my point at A about the provisions and objectives of the plan change, section 32.6 directs that in terms of what the objective of the plan change is. If there aren't specific objectives within it, then it becomes the purpose. And so that reinforces those questions you were asking yesterday as far as what the purpose or objective of the plan change was. And then just outlining that Mr. Lewandowski yesterday confirmed that his section 32 evaluation had considered the existing plan objectives as well as the purpose of the plan change. The next point relates to the MPS for highly productive land. And so there were questions relating to the different definitions within the MPS. And so I've just, to complete the picture on that, have outlined at 4.2 the definition. And so you'll see that says highly productive land means land that's been mapped in accordance with clause 3.4 and is included in an operative RPS. But then you'll see it importantly in brackets, see clause 3.57 for what is treated as highly productive land before these maps are included in an operative RPS. So this definition distinguishes between land mapped in accordance with clause 3.4 and land that should be treated as highly productive land before that mapping exercise is completed. And so then I outline the definition contained in clause 3.57, and you'll see that outlines that it is zoned general rural or rural production and is LUC 1, 2 or 3. So that other limb that is relevant for the council's broader mapping consideration about being part of a broader cohesive area, that is not relevant for interim protection, and that is why we have assessed it in the way we have. You'll also see in B there are exceptions being identified for future urban development. That requires that takes place through a council adopted strategy document, and so we don't have one of those, with notice not having been adopted, and so we don't fall into either 1 or 2, and so that's why we've approached it in the way we have.
Yes.
And then at 4.5, I just make the point in relation to clause 3.64a regarding development capacity. While the focus of our opening submissions was on the retirement village component, yesterday Mr. Heath took the hearing panel to his evidence outlining the growing shortfall in general residential supply. And so those figures 1 and 2 of section 7 of his evidence, those were the ones that Mr. Heath took you to yesterday. Also just wanted to take you to the economic assessment that accompanied the plan change. And if you have a look, there's table 1 in that assessment provides a useful table form that goes through the various numbers that Mr. Heath was reading off those figures, those charts, and includes the relevant NPS buffers and things like that. So that is probably the easiest place to find the specific numbers. Just so for your benefit, I just thought I'd direct you to that as well. And so that assessment identified a shortfall of 2,323 dwellings by 2031 and 7,863 dwellings by 2051 based off the median growth projections. So those are the numbers in that table.
So those added together, like is it they cumulatively?
No, so that is that there are population growth expanding over time, yes. And so when you get to 2031, the shortfall is 2,323 dwellings. Yes. Without intervention. Yes. Over time, that shortfall is exacerbating, okay. So it gets to 7,863 yes. By 2051.
So that last 20 years was a $5,500 household shortfall.
Correct.
Gotcha. Yep.
And so that information is relevant to both criterion A in terms of development capacity and also subclause 5. And we had that discussion yesterday about the minimum extent necessary to provide for that development capacity. And so it is relevant to both those aspects in relation to the essentially the balance part of the site that given that it is identified primarily for the retirement village, but also in light of the fact that the zoning approach is to enable general residential, to the extent that you want additional comfort with that in theory the whole of the site could be rezoned for residential. Those are the numbers, and you heard Mr. Heath's evidence yesterday about how whether it's 99 dwellings or even the 250 odd, that's still only a very small part of the solution required.
Gotcha.
The next point was on structure plans and comprehensive development plans. And so at 5.2, just seek to, as simply as possible, try to clarify that the key directives from the Environment Court in relation to these issues. First one being that it's ultra vires to require a structure plan or similar be sought through a consent process, as a consent process must enable a land use. And so that's where there used to be situations where you would apply for consent for your structure plan. And so that doesn't seem to be what's contemplated here, but that's the first principle. The second one is that it's not appropriate to have the activity status of an activity determined with recourse to another resource consent. Rather, the activity status should be capable of determination based on the district plan itself, essentially, rather than having to look at a third-party document. And then at 5.3, also just reiterate the point that it's ultra vires to have a district plan be amended through a resource consent process. The next aspect is requests for some clearer versions of certain plans. And so these are immediately following my submissions attached. And maybe if we go through those. So there is a black and white copy of the ODP that you can essentially ignore.
Yes.
That's the A3 colour version.
Yes.
And then following that, the other key, there are two parts to the ODP. One is one showing it on a topographical photo, and the other one is a standalone in the manner that could in theory then be incorporated into the district plan, depending on your decision. And then the other image is a clearer version of the figure from Mr. Heath's evidence. And in relation to that and the further clarification sought as to the origin of it, it is a composite plan that has a number of different sources, and we've asked Mr. Heath just to provide a short explanation of those various sources. So that will come through separately just to provide that clarity for you.
Okay.
Then the next lot of plans relates to Somerset's Rangiora village. And so during Mr. Bentley's presentation yesterday, there were questions about that. So there's a few documents attached. So if you go, we work through the next document after the heading Rangiora example is the outline development plan, I think it's called as well.
Yes.
And so that was what ended up through the private plan change process being incorporated into the Waimakariri district plan for that particular site. You'll see some of the similarities in terms of the area identifying a up to 14 metre height restriction area. Because of the height limits in place, there is also a broader area B, that had up to 10.5 metres, but we don't have that issue here. We're simply seeking 14 metre height limit. There is then the council's decision on that private plan change request, which extends over 38 pages. And then following that, so that was the private plan change stage, and then subsequently Somerset went through the detailed design stage and sought and obtained resource consent. So we have provided the master plan that subsequently was part of the approved resource consent for that development, as well as the floor plans for the main building. And so, in part because of the questions about the various amenities provided with Retirement Village, Mr. Smale is able to orient you as far as some of those key features of a village. And then we've also just provided the resource consent decision that resulted in consent being granted for that village. Commissioner McMahon's made various questions, has asked various questions regarding the process if there is dispute. So this plan change enabled retirement villages as a controlled activity. This went through a consent process. This is the consent that was granted. There was subsequently an objection, and so we haven't included that to bombard you with more paper, but there was subsequently a decision on an objection by Somerset in relation to certain conditions of that consent. But that didn't think that that was necessary for your purposes, and it was more just to give a sense of the type of process followed for a retirement village through a similar type of planning framework to what we are seeking from you.
Very helpful. I don't need the plans, and we can read those, I think, unless you have any questions for James.
No, it appears that Rangiora decision was, the resource consent was processed on a non-notified basis.
Correct.
And the timeframes between 2020 for the plan change, and then
from memory, it was 3 to 6 months after the plan change was confirmed. That
May 2021. Okay. And the decision was May 2021, so quite rapid. Yep.
Is there any similarity in terms of the nature of the roading network in Rangiora? I'm sort of familiar with South Belt Road and South Townsend Road are not state highways, are they?
No, and that's probably a difference, but it was certainly a busy road.
Yes. Thank you.
So those were the only matters that were raised yesterday that were asked for comments. So
Yes.
just wanted to address you on those, and otherwise we'll hand over to the final witness.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to your team for putting this together, and very classy paper as well. Congratulate you on that. Look and feel very, very classy. Thank you.
Got that already.
Do you?
Yeah, we both have. Yes.
Okay.
With courtesy of Georgia.
Afternoon.
A couple of miscellaneous matters I think to address before going into my summary statement. In reviewing my evidence and sheet, I just noted 3 very, very minor typographical errors. Would you like me to cover those off very briefly? They're immaterial, but thank you. That's easy. Thank you. There were 2 loose threads that were left yesterday that I can address. One was in relation to, I think, a question from Commissioner McMahon about assessment criteria and applicability to controlled and restricted discretionary activity. Yes. I'm looking at, if you have it in front of you, in page 5-20 of the district plan. Okay, well, perhaps to describe, at the end of a controlled activity rule and at the end of a restricted discretionary rule, there is a section under each that says assessment criteria, and in respect of controlled activities, it says controlled activities will be assessed against the relevant assessment criteria set out in section 22, and there is the equivalent statement made under the restricted discretionary rule.
Section 22, did you say?
Section 22, that being the section that contains assessment criteria in the plan.
And the proposed plan change doesn't alter that section, does it?
It introduces assessment criteria specific to this retirement village.
Then 5 it is too. 22.2, 25.
Correct.
And again, that's drawing on the approach with the other retirement village, presumably.
Correct, but that's also drawing on a more general approach in the plan to all such activities. The second thread related to, I think, again, Commissioner McMahon, in an exchange you gave with Mr. Brent around Green Waters matters and how that's covered off relative to matters of control or otherwise. I've addressed it in my evidence, but just to speak to that perhaps briefly. Standard 21.1.26, which is a district-wide standard, requires that, I'm just finding it myself.
Is that in your evidence, Mitch?
It is. So,
can you take us there?
Paragraph 8.16 of my evidence, page 56.
Eight point one six.
8.16, correct.
Yes.
So what I say there, Commissioners, is that there is an existing district-wide standard at 21.1.26 that requires new water, wastewater and stormwater infrastructure to be provided in accordance with NZS 4404. That standard would apply to the construction of a retirement village as it's a district-wide standard. Non-compliance with that standard triggers a resource consent requirement under 21.4.17. I've set that out at paragraph 8.17 of my evidence on the next page, and I list there for you the matters of discretion. There is a feedback loop, if you like, created into Rule 5.5.3e by specifying a matter of control over the provision of water supply, wastewater disposal, and stormwater collection and disposal. And that's amendment
Roman numeral 2.
Roman numeral 2, correct. Oh, Roman numeral 3, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Roman numeral 2 is particular to firefighting.
Yes.
And you heard from Mr. Brents yesterday that, as I understand it, NZS 4404 is a higher level standard, and SNZ PAS 4509, if you like, is subservient to that. So 4404 references the particular firefighting standard.
Yes. Mr. Lewandowski, I think I asked that yesterday, Rule 21.1.26, that district-wide rule, requiring compliance with 4404. Is it a land use or a subdivision or rule?
That is a district-wide land use rule, but...
You said there was a similar...
Correct. So if we go back to my evidence at 8.18,
yes,
I say there, I note that a subdivision, if a controlled activity, also requires compliance with NZS 4404, and I reference there the appropriate standard, and non-compliance with that standard would elevate a resource consent to a discretionary activity. So it's the equivalent.
Yes.
I think that takes us to my summary statement.
Yes, thanks. Thank you.
My planning assessment relates to proposed private plan change to rezone approximately 14.7 hectares of land in the northern Marston Township. The purpose of this statement is to provide you with a summary of my evidence. With reference to the assessment prepared by various subject matter experts, I consider that the environmental effects resulting from the plan change appropriately seeks reason the site to use energy purposes. Thereby, I also consider the range of positive effects also. In respect of traffic and infrastructure effects, reference to the evidence of Mr. Georgeson, Mr. Merson, and Mr. Brents, consider that the provisions of the Combined Wairarapa District Plan, including those changes proposed through the plan change, and appropriately address any remaining effects subsequent to the plan change is consistent with relevant statutory requirements and policies. Consider that the policy statement on urban development, policy statement for productive land are primary. In respect of the NPSUD, I assess that the plan change is consistent with the relevant policies. In particular, I consider that the plan change will achieve a well-functioning urban environment as defined by Policy 1. I consider with reference to the evidence of Mr. Georgeson that resulting development will achieve an appropriate level of accessibility between the site, the Masterton Town Centre and other amenities. This will include by active modes through existing connections to existing transport corridors and by not including future improvements and the provision of future services.
Mr. Lewandowski, is that the test? I'm not saying it's not. I'm just wondering if it is the test that it's not stipulated or not expressed as a more positive of outcome of providing future improvements. You've said you've used the words by not precluding. So the ability to achieve connections in the future Is that what the MPSUD is looking at, as opposed to more actively promoting them as part of what the plan change?
Yes, no, I understand, and I think in the first instance, my view is that there is an appropriate level of connection currently.
Yeah, I understand that.
The preclusion, I think, sir, is particular to public transport, which is outside of Welhom's direct control. And what those provisions are seeking to do is to recognise that an evolution of particularly PT is time dependent and there's not going to be an immediate service that becomes available. So in that sense, I think it's important that plan provisions aren't including it, providing for considerations that can lead to that service being established in that area.
Yeah. Understand your answer. I was just wondering aloud though, whether the direction was focusing solely at PT or whether it was looking at all forms of connections.
Oh.
And I'm mindful of what Mr. Georgeson said yesterday about the potential for connections for walking and cycling.
Yes. So again, I think the starting point is we assess it on what it has and the level of suitability of that. I come to it later on as well, Commissioner McMahon, that there is a recognition that in any urban environment, there is an ongoing evolution in the nature and type of infrastructure that's being provided. And if we look around the country, we can focus on Wellington, for example, there is a significant investment going on in cycling infrastructure right now across the city. There's continuous improvement and investment in parks networks and other connections of that sort. So to come back, what is the test? Well, the test is now. That's not to say we can't look at potential improvements down the line, what's on the horizon, or what could be on the horizon.
Okay.
We need to weight that accordingly.
Okay. Thank you.
Picking up at 1.6, in respect of the NCS HPL and with reference to the evidence of Mrs. Dillon and Heath, I consider the plan change meets the particular considerations of clause 3.6 relating to the rezoning of highly thematic land. Under clause 3, subclause 3.65, territorial authorities must ensure that the spatial extent to be rezoned is, sorry, that's a typo, is the minimum necessary to provide for the required development capacity while achieving a well-functioning urban environment. I consider that it is appropriate to rezone the site as a whole to provide for the balance of the site as residential development. Doing so will ensure that the future retirement village sits within a broader residential context and a variety of housing consistent with a well-functioning urban environment. And the particular reference there, sir, is policy 1A in terms of meeting the needs in terms of price, type, price and location of different households. To leave a small portion of the site rurally zoned would further exacerbate the fragmentation seen in the area. It would be incredibly difficult to utilise the small balance lot for rural productive purposes without disrupting the numerous residential neighbours. Therefore, it is crucial that the whole site is rezoned. Regarding the regional policy statement for Wellington, my assessment in the request application finds that the plan change achieves consistency with the RPS. I've noted in my evidence that proposed change 1 has been notified to the RPS. In my assessment, limited weight should be afforded to PC1 given the stage of development. Notwithstanding that view, I consider the plan change nevertheless achieves consistency with PC1. At section 2, I agree with Ms. Barr that the master urban growth strategy is not a required consideration. Similarly, also agree that the draft district plan is not a statutory document. However, as discussed further below, I disagree that they should be ignored, and Mr. McMahon just talked to you about that also. Ms. Barr accepts the Council Advisor's opinion that the infrastructure concerns in the Section 40 raised in the Section 42A report can be considered at the resource consenting stage. Now, just to correct an error there, sir, that should read the exception of water supply. I agree with that conclusion in respect. Well, I agree with that conclusion in respect of water and stormwater. Sorry, wastewater and stormwater. The discussion, I guess, has moved on somewhat yesterday from Mr. Brinson and Mr. Rose, and I've just talked you through my reading of how the plan would deal with that under any NZS 4404 in any case. At 2.3, Ms. Barnard proposed changes to standard 5.5.20 of the residential zone provisions to clarify the applicability of the standard to the area of the site where the retirement village is proposed. Ms. Barnard also proposed minor changes to other proposed amendments to improve usability. I agree with these changes as detailed in my evidence and have incorporated these into the amendments to the plan change provisions in Appendix 2. The outstanding issues, I note my disagreement regarding the relevance of the MUGs and the EDP. While I accept that there is a determination whether the swap weight should be accorded to these, I disagree that they should be ignored. Both documents provide useful context on the Council's strategic approach to future growth. I have reviewed the 4 statements of evidence provided by Waikakotahi. I comment on these below, in particular those from Ms. Sanamand and Ms. State. Ms. Sanamand is correct. The sole vehicular connection to the site is through the Cashmere Oaks Drive and State Highway 2 intersection. However, pedestrian and bicycle connection is now available through to Myra Street to the south, as shown in Figure 1. I should caveat that, sir, and you would have seen that there is a screen at the end, so that should more appropriately read that the construction of that path has been completed. I'm not aware when that fencing will come down, but obviously it's related to the construction activities there currently.
Yes, thank you.
In turn, that will also lead towards State Highway 2 in the Master Plan Centre and connect to State Highway 2 where it operates at 50 km/h speed limit. Ms. Georgeson has highlighted the proximity from Myra Street to other potential transport infrastructure. I note as a matter of interest that the letter of assurance provided by Waikakotahi is appended to Ms. Sanamand's evidence outlined the majority of the site as being forming part of the open growth area, while ultimately not included in the district plan. It highlights the long-standing consideration of the site as a location for urban development. And just to pause there, commissioners can note that in the lead up to the lodgement of the request, I did seek some clarification as to why that site fell away, and I wasn't able to get an answer from the council on that point. We may get more, but my inquiries didn't lead to any specific decision or reason for that falling away. At paragraph 6.8 of the evidence, Ms. Sanamand agrees with Ms. Barnard regarding the applicability of the draft district plan in the MUGs for the reasons I've outlined in my evidence. I disagree with both the relevant documents that can and should be considered. At paragraph 7.2, Ms. Sanamand queries how the northern and southern transport connections, and I presume she's referring to those noted on the proposed ODP, are intended to interact, spread traffic through the roading network, address traffic safety, or how they might relate to urban performance function. The purpose of the ODP is to indicate the potential for future connections. It outlines the proposed connection into the site. Further connections beyond that are not confirmed through the ODP, but the possibility for such connections is highlighted and would support the direction of the DDP in identifying the site as part of a future urban zone. In section 9 of the evidence, Ms. Sanamand discusses the activity status and consent requirements for future development. At paragraph 9.2, she considers that a controlled activity subdivision will not provide for the consideration of safety effects at the intersection of Cashmere Oaks Drive and State Highway 2 or wider transport effects. I have considered Rule 20.1.1 and the matters of control provided by matter I is relevant and sets out, Roman numeral 1 should say, and sets out the relevant matter of control, and that's my emphasis there, sir, highlighting the provision of footpaths and cycleways, provision of linkages to existing roads, and alteration to any existing roads as a matter of control. This matter of control should be read with reference to the assessment criteria contained in section 21.1.1, and I set that out there for you in respect to subdivision that includes the cumulative impacts on infrastructure and the capacity, safety and efficiency of the road and network. Again, my emphasis. I disagree with Mr. Demand that cumulative and safety effects cannot be considered under this rule, or that effects on the wider traffic network cannot be considered. In respect of proposed rule 5.5.3e, Mr. Demand considers that the scope of the matters of control are unclear. It only applies to part of the site. Safety interventions may not align with Whakatahi requirements, and not all transport infrastructure issues are considered. I disagree. The relevant matters as amended by my suggested changes in Appendix 2 address, and I set out those provisions there that you're familiar with so far. That rule establishes that at a broad level, roading and road safety matters are a matter of control. It then identifies a range of detailed matters to ensure that a high degree of specificity in the Council's control is apparent. I consider such an approach to be appropriate. Mr. Demand disagrees that Rule 20.1.5 (J) as a discretionary subdivision rule would apply to the site as a result of its connection to State Highway 2. While I note her view, it is the opinion of the Council and its application of this rule that is relevant. The Council has confirmed that the rule would apply to a subdivision of the site. Access to the site would be a direct extension of Cashmere Oaks Drive, which is the road connecting to State Highway 2. I do not agree with Ms. Sandeman's comment at paragraph 9.13 that all subdivision within Cashmere Oaks would have needed to be processed under this discretionary activity rule. Cashmere Oaks subdivision was first consented as a discretionary activity through a development concept plan. Subsequent stages of that development concept plan were then considered as a control activity. If those later stages were inconsistent with the development concept plan overrule, then Rule 20.1.5J may have been triggered. In respect of a comment, paragraph 9.14, that a recent subdivision of the site did not result in Whakatahi being notified of that subdivision, I understand that subdivision was a boundary adjustment that did not create a new parcel. I don't see a reason why Whakatahi would have been notified in those circumstances. Even in the event that Rule 20.1.5J were not applicable, I consider that the matters of control outlined at paragraphs 3.10 and 3.11 above provide the Council with sufficient control to address related transport matters based on the density of development and a resultant yield that could be provided for as a controlled activity. So what that is effectively saying is that the scenario 1 situation, as assessed by Mr. Georgeson, the effects of that can be addressed for the matters of control that are there currently in the situation that that discretionary rule were not applicable.
And that's scenario 1 being the full residential.
That's scenario 1 for residential trees. Ms. Saint-Amand, back at paragraph 3.19, Ms. Saint-Amand and Mr. Connolly both comment on the degree or otherwise permitted development enabled by the residential zone and the ability to consider the traffic effects of that development. Particularly, they focus on non-residential development, highlighting healthcare activities, community facilities, and education and childcare. I note that a key standard relating to non-residential activities is a limitation of no more than 2 non-resident employees. Non-compliance with that standard requires a resourcing centre as a restricted discretionary activity under Rule 554. Council's discretion is restricted to avoiding, remedying or mitigating any effects deriving from non-compliance with the particular standard. So in other words, the compliance with the employee numbers in this instance. Traffic considerations in my view would clearly become relevant for a non-residential activity or in breach of that standard, non-compliance with off-site staff limits. This limits the scale of potential non-residential activities, which is not acknowledged by Ms. Saint-Amand and Mr. Connolly. I otherwise agree that some non-residential activities are an expected part of any residential environment, and consider that they add to the qualities that provide for a well-functioning urban environment. It is possible that some might establish on the site. I do not, however, expect a proliferation of non-residential activities to establish in this area that fundamentally affect Mr. Georgeson's traffic consideration. Ms. Saint-Amand also suggests that the overall site could be developed with housing as a permitted activity without a resource consent. Commissioner, I took you through this matter yesterday, and I proposed an amendment that, if you like, closes the potential for a loophole there in the most recent set of amendments that you have. I consider that such a change can be made within the scope of relief sought by the submission of Wakatatahi and or as a consequential amendment.
Just on that, do we actually have a latest set of amendments?
The ones, yes, yes. So what
one of those now, so the most up-to-date version was from our legal submissions. There's an updated version that Mr. Lewandowski's will take you through shortly in relation to that information requirement.
Okay, so there is another version, but you'll present that to us at the end.
Imminently.
Okay, thank you.
For the purposes of what I'm addressing now, you have that change.
You've already given us that in your appendix.
Today's legal submissions, correct?
Yes, so that's the appendix 1 to the legal submissions.
And that's the one dwelling per site rule.
Specific to that appendix. So that change there would limit the number of dwellings to one per site, thereby ensuring that any future residential development not related to a retirement village would need to be preceded by a subdivision. Relatedly, Mr. Connolly in paragraph 55 of his evidence states, additionally, the plan allows for 2 dwellings per lot. The plan does not allow for 2 dwellings per lot and enables multiple dwellings per site, provided that each meets the minimum lot size. At paragraph 10.11, Ms. Saint-Amand considers that the inclusion of matter 4 within the proposed rule 5.3e confuses the rule because the rule applies in quotations within the land identified as residential/retirement village development at appendix 16. What she's referencing there is the heading of the rule, and she omits the end of that heading, and I provide that in full overlay. So I say 3.27, this is the heading of the rule which identifies its purpose. There is nothing about the heading of the rule that precludes the matters of control being applied on their face, i.e. the safety improvements to occur at the intersection of Cashmere Drive and State Highway. I note that Mr. Connolly addressed construction management, paragraphs 126 and 127 of his evidence, and the updated set of district plan changes that we've just referred to specify construction traffic effects as a matter of control relative to a retirement. At paragraph 10.13, Ms. Saint-Amand considers that Wakatatahi may withhold its approval to any safety improvements at the intersection, or that such an approval may be provided with conditions that better the ability of a resource consent to be given effect to. Ms. Saint-Amand is suggesting that Wakatatahi would oppose safety improvements because those improvements do not satisfy its demands, notwithstanding this. Apologies to Ms. Merson, and Mr. Georgeson's evidence is that such interventions are appropriate, and there's been some talk around that matter already. Ms. Saint-Amand considers that a more appropriate rule framework to be based on a discretionary activity standard for both subdivision and the retirement village and an associated structure plan. This view is grounded in a more fundamental disagreement as to what improvements are required to that intersection. Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Merson are of the view that the intersection can safely and efficiently accommodate the traffic generation from subsequent development. Resultingly, I consider that the nature of any intervention required can be provided for under the proposed controlled activity rule for the retirement village, and the discretionary brackets or controlled subdivision rule. I do not agree that a structure plan is a necessary precursor to development of the site. The site is a 14.7 hectare allotment, the majority of which is proposed to be developed for the purposes of a retirement village. Such a village will be master planned. The plan change seeks to insert an ODP which serves to identify this but also picks up some key elements of what a structure plan would achieve in the
Mitch, what do you think could be added to the outline development plan that would be useful at a plan making stage? Is there anything you could think about that could be added to the outline development plan?
I think proportionally to what is being proposed, no, I don't. I think what is there is ticking the key boxes. So the access point, the location of fire development, we've got the spring planting along the northern boundary, and then the only real element there is highlighting the potential for future connections.
And the indicative stormwater area.
And the stormwater area, of course, yes, quite right.
So there wouldn't be any purpose in going into any more detail in a plan, in your view?
No, not in my view. No. The distinction, I think, what I'm trying to draw, and I think what the Kotahi's perspective is their position that there are precursor interventions that are required. I mean, we fundamentally disagree with that proposition around the intersection, etc.
I presume, yeah.
That's where the hook for a structure plan is appealing from their point of view.
I'm presuming, yeah, we'll hear from Catherine later about what she thinks might go into a said structure plan.
Picking up at point 33, I do not consider that there are sufficient matters requiring specific management that necessitate a structure plan approach. Zone-based approach, as proposed, is in my view appropriate. I consider, again in reliance on Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Merson, that the scope of interventions required to address traffic safety matters are appropriately provided for. Existing and proposed structure plan provisions provide other mode share considerations along with existing infrastructure that includes the Naira Street connection. I do not consider that the retirement village rule requires specific reference to cumulative effects as suggested by Ms. Sandeman. The rule provides for consideration of roading effects at a rural level. Definition of effect, of course, includes cumulative effects. As already addressed at 3.10, cumulative effects will be considered through any subdivision resource consent. Sandeman considers the NPSUD in section 11 of the evidence. She notes that in paragraph 11.4 that an overall theme in part 2 is to achieve a well-functioning urban environment. She considers that there are a number of ways in which that can be achieved, and she suggests that the NPSUD calls for integrated planning decisions in order to achieve that outcome, i.e. a well-functioning urban environment, and with reference to Objective 6. Objective 1 of the NPSUD seeks that New Zealand has well-functioning urban environment. A well-functioning urban environment is defined by Policy 1, not Objective 6, or other objectives of policy. Objective 1 does not have any primacy in the structure of the NPSUD, and there is no overall purpose statement for the NPSUD, unlike, for instance, the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. Objective 6 does not speak to whether a well-functioning urban environment is achieved or not. At paragraph 11.10, the same demand highlights Policy 1(c) and Policy 5. Policy 1(c) requires that urban developments have good accessibility for all people between housing, jobs, community services, natural spaces and open spaces, including by way of public or active transport. Ms. Saint-Amand acknowledges at paragraph 4.8 and 11.14 that the site is in good proximity to these amenities, but it is the nature of the connections with which she isn't satisfied. Ms. Spake also notes at paragraph 1.8 of her evidence that Waikatahi is not opposed to development occurring to the north of Mare system. As detailed in my evidence and the evidence of Mr. Georgeson, the site will link to existing connections via Cashmere Oaks Drive and through Mare Street. I consider these connections to be suitable and note that they can also, going to our earlier discussions, Commissioner McMahon, be improved in future along with wider network improvement and additions. It is not uncommon that infrastructure investment is an ongoing issue, as evidenced by comprehensive investment in cycleways occurring across New Zealand, and including through changes to state highway environment.
Presumably, if plan change had a component to it that precluded such connections, you'd come to a different view on that.
that precluded future additional connections, I think that would still turn on what has existed.
That would go to the sufficiency of the existing.
Correct.
If they were not optimal, and there could be better connections in the
and
future.
There were limitations to that occurring.
Yes.
That would certainly inform the calculus. Okay. I do not, at paragraph 3.39, I do not see the relevance of Ms. Saint-Amand's reference to policy 5. The policy speaks to enabling height and density requirements. As noted in my evidence, the council will appropriately consider this policy for its plan review. Ms. Saint-Amand considers the RPS at section 12 of her evidence. I have provided an assessment of the RPS where I consider that the plan change achieves consistency with it. Ms. Saint-Amand's difference in opinion is again born out of a fundamental disagreement on the efficient and safe operation of the transport network and the suitability of multimodal and public transport options. I have addressed these matters and reached a different conclusion in reliance on the views of Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Mewson. St. Amand also addresses Objective 10 and policies 7, 8 and 39 relating to regionally significant infrastructure. Again, the genesis of her concerns in respect of these provisions lies in a disagreement on the safe and efficient operation of State Highway 2 and the Cashmere intersection. Based on the evidence of Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Mewson, I disagree. She also notes, Ms. St. Amand, also notes in paragraph 12.5 that the plan change will not result in good urban form, function, or promote a compact and well-designed urban form. I consider her views around not resulting in a good urban form or maintaining a compact urban form and consistent with her views expressed at her paragraphs 4.8 and 11.14 and of the state of her paragraph 1.8. At Ms. St. Amand's paragraph 12.10, she describes the proposal as relying on existing infrastructure designed for a future urban area in a rural context. Designing for a future, my emphasis urban area, would suggest to me that the area was no longer rural in nature. The state at paragraph 8.6 also describes the road as being in a rural context. The urban development along this stretch of State Highway 2 is plainly evident, and this ongoing change does not appear to be responded to through the management of the State Highway. Quick review of the zoning for this area clearly shows a strong urban context from the south to the north of the Cashmere Oaks Drive intersection before changing to a rural environment. And I picked up on the reference to the RV corner circuit that on the eastern side, that's where the urban boundary is effectively linked. Relatedly, Ms. St. Amand highlights policy TT1 brackets A of the district plan. That policy states identify and manage a hierarchy of roads from the Wairarapa to ensure that the function of each role is recognised and protected in the management of subdivision and land use. The district plan has given effect to this policy through its roading classification. It is the evidence of Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Mewson that the plan change can be accommodated within the existing environment. Contrary to her statement at paragraph 12.16, the plan change does provide intervention in the wider roading environment. The point of disagreement concerns the nature of the intervention that's required. Ms. St. Amand then considers that utilising a future development area framework of the district plan to be more appropriate. I agree that a future development approach can be warranted at times. Clearly, there were a number of areas that were identified as such during the development of the current district plan. I'm not sure why Ms. St. Amand has referenced policy 18.3.11e relating to the Greytown future development area. I assume as the policy references the need for a structure plan to be prepared, she considers such an approach to be warranted here. I note that the Opaki future development area, where Cashmere Oaks is located, does not have an equivalent policy and has been developed without a structure plan. Rather, the approach in the Opaki development area, future development area, was through the district plan framework requiring a development concept plan to be prepared and approved as a precursor to future development. I note the findings of the Environment Court in the Queenstown Airport case reference there, and considering such a two-stage approach to be ultra-vires, and Mr. Minton explained to you about that a short time ago. Notwithstanding those views, I do not consider those structured plan approaches necessary. The The site, again, is comparatively small at 14.7 hectares and will be principally occupied by a retirement village. A small balance of the site will be available for traditional residential development. There are no special features to be managed. Infrastructure connections are available at the boundary, and notwithstanding different views, Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Nielsen consider that the traffic effects can be suitably addressed.
Yes. Mr. Lewandowski, I wonder whether your reference to will on the third line might be best be a reference to maybe principally.
Yes, I perhaps am reflecting Somerset's intent, but you're quite right, sir, that the underlying zoning change, that's fair.
Thank you.
Picking up at 3.49, relatedly, I do not support the same man's view that paragraph 11.7 that rezoning of the site is more appropriately considered during the district plan. One of the drivers of the request was a result of the timing of the review process. The requester is entitled to rely on the private plan change process as a means to achieve that.
Richard, we could stop there. Megan, what is the current time frame for notifying the district plan? I've read June 2023, which is about 3 months away. Is that happening?
Yeah, I understand that is still the goal timeline.
Is that going to be achieved, do you think? Do you know?
I honestly couldn't speak to that. I'd have to double check with Christine.
Christine's here now. So, Christine, are we still on track for June 2023?
No, sir.
Yes.
It has been close for August.
August
August.
2023. Thank you. Thanks much.
Commissioner, you'll be aware, of course, that effect of such a of a new plan, of course, is further out as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've just chaired a
Yeah,
full plan review, so it takes a while to work its way through the winding pathways.
Picking up at 3.50, Ms. Spake also notes, including in her paragraph 5.19, that the site is not identified by the Wellington Growth Framework. As I have noted in my evidence, the WRG attempts growth locations very coarsely. I accept that the site is not specifically identified at that scale. The growth framework does appear to identify greenfield growth at the northern edge of Masterton. It's suggested that this references the existing Cashmere Oak subdivision. I simply note, therefore, that the growth framework as a future growth strategy appears to map an area already consented and in large part already developed for future growth. I also highlight the advice recorded in my evidence about draft district plan is superseding the regional growth. Requiring future development to be recognised in the Wellington Regional Growth Framework or other planning document is inconsistent with Policy 8 of the NPSUD, which requires local authority decisions to be responsive to plan changes that would add significant development capacity. Ms. Sainaman also references the inclusion of the Wangawa structure plan in the district plan, with reference to necessary roading improvements in the area. I do not have a detailed familiarity with that area and accept the structure plan at face value. I simply note that Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Nielsen do not consider that there is a necessity for greater interventions in this instance than what are provided for. I also note that the plan change seeks to include an ODP to guide future development, and note that the development of the site for retirement village purposes, as evidenced by Mr. Smale, would occur promptly. The necessity for a future development area over an underlying residential zone in this context is further unnecessary. The situation contrasts with the delay between the ODP development area being firstly identified in the district plan and subsequently developed.
Can I just clarify something there, Mitch? The 3.52, two sentences. The first one, you're talking about the Wangawa structure plan, and then you're having a commentary on the relevance of that in terms of interventions in this plan change. You say that, or you reference Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Mewson not considering that there's any necessity for greater interventions in this other than what is provided for. Now, at this point, nothing is provided for, but there's a process, presumably through the controlled activity status, to decide whether there's a need for improvements and alterations or safety improvements at the intersection.
That's accurate. Yeah, that's accurate, Commissioner. I think what that's addressing is that Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Wilson have a disagreement as compared to the interventions that Wahakatahi are suggesting are required.
Yes.
That's perhaps a more accurate way to frame what I'm suggesting.
Yes, but you'd agree that at this point, nothing is provided for. Not even the interventions that Ms. Mewson identified in that paragraph 3.38 or in a summary.
We have a range of matters of control that are to be informed by an ITA subsequently. Correct.
Okay, thank you. You got 354.
3.4, thank you, sir. Ms. Sandeman concludes with an examination of the financial contributions chapter of the plan. She focuses on 23.4.2E of the district plan, and that provides for, well, I've set out the matter there, relating to a reasonable share of the cost of new upgraded roads or access, etc. Her concern is that there is a need to agree on the infrastructure required to accommodate that additional growth in order to determine a reasonable share. This spoke in her paragraph 1.9D, also notes that development will put financial pressure on road controlling authorities. I note again that Ms. George and Ms. Wilson disagree with the nature of the interventions that Wahakatahi consider are required. I also note that Sandeman ignores the financial contribution that would apply in respect of roading standard 23.4.1A requires, and I've added some emphasis there, as a condition of a land use resource consent for residential, commercial industrial activity. The next relevant there, a contribution required under section 23.4.2 brackets G, and that again is referenced a bit further down. An equivalent standard applies under subdivision, and I've given you the rule reference, and for permitted activity development, again giving you the rule reference. The standard 23.4.2G then provides for general district-wide roads, access and loading contribution of 2% of the land value of each allotment to be created. Now, so what I omitted there was it's prefaced for subdivision. So at 3.59, I say, while I note that 23.4.2G refers to subdivision, I consider that because 23.4.1A, which is the first standard that then refers to this one, refers to it in the context of a land use consent, that 23.4.2G, in my view, would be applicable to a land use consent. In particular, 23.4.1A specifically contemplates a contribution under that standard for land use consent applications where a contribution has not already been made at the subdivision stage. So there's a matter of interpretation here. I've considered it and discussed it with Mr. Minhana. My view, and I guess a collective view, is that we consider it would be applicable. If there is a need, in your view, for some drafting tweaks there, we could make those particular to the site so that it's not having wider plan implications across a broader residential or other zone. But in our first reading, we can, well, I consider that it would be applicable, notwithstanding what is conflicting draft out there.
Megan, what's your take? Or do you want to ponder it?
No, I think that because it has taken such a high degree of interpretation, I think it is unclear, and if it is intended to be implemented in an uncontested fashion in the future, then it should be corrected so that it's clear what it applies to.
Let's do that.
We can do that.
Yes.
As a matter of interest and clarification, I would be interested to know how the council has been applying it to date.
Yes. Let's take that out of the
But
if you want to offer that up as a proposition to us. The other thing, the 2%, that would just go to the council. It wouldn't be available for state highway works.
How the council then deals with it, it's not for me to speak to, but the answer to the first part of the question is that the financial contributions paid to the council.
Okay.
3.60, I also know the purpose of such contributions, as set out at 23.4.4a, is to provide the safe and convenient movement on roads with motor vehicles, bicycles and pedestrians within and through the borough. Resultingly, both the future retirement village and the subdivision of the balance of the site will make a general road and financial contribution. I do not agree with the statement based on the evidence of Mr. George and Mr. Nielsen that such a contribution is required under 23.4.2e relating to specific infrastructure upgrade. I note that Ms. Barr considers that the development is not unusual in the type of financial contributions that might be considered necessary, and Section 23 of the district plan covers the circumstances where a contribution is required.
Digging down to 23.4.4a, because it talks about on roads, could that contribution be used, for example, to build the cycleway along the railway corridor, and if that was the most effective?
I don't want to dip my oar onto that one, sir. That's a question for the council. On its face, the roads. Yeah, then you've got to within no. My intuitive answer is no, sir, but I wouldn't want to be definite.
Okay. Well, I think if we are setting something up that we can craft some wording, if you wanted to think about that as well.
Think about a potential change there.
Yeah. Okay. So just to make it more flexible, perhaps, if that's not a problem.
Yeah, we would need to be careful to not be
not to stuff
rewriting
up.
a district-wide policy. Yeah,
No, that's right. Yes.
Lastly, in my assessment, the plan change appropriately seeks to rezone the site for residential purposes. It provides a framework to appropriately manage the environmental effects of resultant development with achievable functioning urban environment as required by the NPSUD, and appropriately seeks to rezone land identified as being highly productive. Anticipating questions, of course, but we provided you with an updated set here of changes. Perhaps if I take you briefly through those.
No, they're coming now, I think. Have the other parties got this?
Soft copies have been circulated.
Great, thanks, Jacob.
So the changes Commissioners made here relate to the discussions yesterday with, I think, Commissioner about the integrated transport assessment. So I can take you to Amendment 6.
Yes.
Matter 2. So we previously simply stated an integrated transport assessment. We've now added, I've now added the words which shall address but is not limited to. And just to pause on that idea, you heard from Mr. Georgeson before about the ITA manual and the various scopes of ITA that can occur. So that change there is seeking to, I guess, be consistent with that approach of there are parameters that inform an ITA, and at the very least, an ITA in this context needs to address these matters. And the matters that are there listed below are taken from the existing controlled activity rule, or the proposed, controlled activity rule, and reflected in this. So there is a linkage between those two things. And matter F is not in the controlled activity rule, but is included here. And that is the outcomes of consultation with New Zealand Transport Agency. That is again reflected on the conversation you were having with Mr. Georgeson of usual practice around these things, and that's, if you like, codifying that aspect. I can take you very quickly to Amendment 5, but it's on the page that Amendment 6 starts on. You might have noticed two green words have stuck in there. So that is the assessment criteria. And just to further clarify Roman numeral 4 there, I've included transport infrastructure, the words transport infrastructure in that assessment criteria, particular to a retirement village.
These changes are shaded green, so that would suggest they would be giving effect to the relief requested by Waka Kotahi. Is that correct?
In terms of the legends, the guide at the start, we've just termed that further changes proposed by Welhom Developments in response to the evidence. And of course, I guess in the context of the Appendix 6 section, in response to your questioning, etc. So.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. What intrigues me, Mr. Lewandowski, is how there can be some disagreement on the subdivision rule and whether it's controlled or discretionary. And of course, I mean, we'll be looking to Ms. Barr to provide some guidance on that. But why is there that those? What is the possible reason for the difference? Is it found in the rules?
Yeah, and
architecture, or
I'll take you to it, sir.
of course, we don't have it in front of us.
No, it's where is it outlined? It is outlined in. Yeah, it's definitely in the Santa Maria evidence, but I think it's in mine as well. 20.1. Ms. Santa Maria, yes, quite right. Ms. Santa Maria's evidence includes an appendix in which she, appendix 3 is Ms. Santa Maria. Thank you.
Yes.
In which she attaches an email exchange between myself and Ms. Barr.
Yes.
But if I could step back just a little bit before that, and in my review of the plan that informed, I think, the drafting of the request, I came across this rule, and my initial reading of it was that it would be applicable. In subsequent discussions with Ms. Santa Maria, I expressed that view, she expressed a contrary view. And in those discussions, went back and reread the rule and thought, well, you know, arguably it could be read in one of two ways. So at that point, I sought the clarification from Ms. Barr, and that is the email exchange that you have in front of you. She sets out a collective logic there between herself and Ms. Chong as well. And as I say, that aligns with my initial reading of that rule. That is my understanding based on that email of how the council will interpret and apply that rule. And hopefully, Commissioner McMahon, that answers your question as to how it could be read, differently. But I come back to, well, you know, the council was principally the first arbiter of that rule, and therefore I rely on that interpretation.
Yes. Does the interpretation turn particularly on the words with access to a state highway?
I think so, sir. Because to follow Ms. Santa Maria's logic, if we go to the furthest reaches of Masterton and the furthest cul-de-sac, ultimately it connects to the state highway. What my point here is that access to this site is a direct extension of Cashmere Oaks Drive, which is the principal connector to the state highway.
Okay, thank you.
Thinking you've got a wry smile on your face.
Yes, I will address that tomorrow in my evidence. It was a question that was asked without context, and so we did apply logic to it. And since having provided the investigation of the role and associated policies that you see in the email before you, and further investigation has revealed that council has not been applying the rule in this way. So to some extent, Ms. Sinman is correct in her comments around the rule. So it remains possibly a very difficult rule to implement, in that it is not clear how far from a state highway access to, or what exactly access to means, whether it is a direct vehicle crossing onto, or whether it's further from this.
So it might be quite good to get some interpretation from a legal, how a lawyer would read things, which is always just another flavour. That would be helpful too.
Mr. Lewandowski, you've indicated that at your 358 that you might want to undertake some tweaks to clarify the relationship between clauses A and G in 23.4, so that it relates solely to this development as opposed to having district-wide application.
Correct.
In terms of what we've just discussed in relation to the controlled/discretionary, is it feasible to undertake similar tweaks to, if they were deemed to be necessary, to clarify the intention of the rule in relation to this site?
We can do that. I think there's scope to do that in relation to subdivision law.
Yes, subdivision.
Yeah, certainly.
Whether you agree with it is another matter, of course.
Well, yeah, I think the key question is the whole purpose of those changes relies on the way the council is interpreting and applying the plan. And so I think in relation to both of those aspects, the council's view on whether they apply is, and the way they apply is critical. We're applying it in the way we understand the council.
Yes.
Is, but I think that direction will assist both yourselves as well as everyone.
Well, might give us a degree of certainty and take the interpretation component out of the equation.
I'd also just loop back, Commissioner McMahon, to say that, and as I addressed, irrespective, I think the control activity rule still does the things that Waikato is concerned about doing in terms of the consideration of those effects and the ability to intervene at that instance.
Yes, I appreciate that. The extent of my remaining questions are really just twofold. And at the risk of repeating what I said at the beginning, there's clearly quite a polarised position between yourself and Ms. St. Ahmad about the need for intervention, type of intervention, the timing of the intervention, and the process for intervention. You favour controlled activity to assess that at the time in terms of the prevailing conditions. I think one of the key matters there will be the speed environment that exists at the time of any future resource consent. And the position of Ms. St. Amand is clear also, and we'll test her on that also. But I don't see any benefit in taking that any further. The positions are clear. What I'm interested in is, in your experience in district plan writing and consenting, whether there are other examples of controlled activity dealing with the potential for intervention on a state highway for urban growth areas. And it's something that Ms. Barr and Ms. St. Armand will want to answer also, I imagine.
On the spot, sir, I can't think of one. I can think of, for instance, the St. Patrick's estate land in our hut. That's not a direct state highway connection, but it's very proximate to a direct state highway state highway location. That provides currently for a range of activities, disregarding the flood hazards there, as a controlled activity. That's one that immediately comes to mind. I would need to sit down and have a think about it. But coming, I think, to what the underlying point though is, the controlled activity rule as framed provides for a broad range of interventions. Now, what we ultimately land on the nature of it is as a point of dispute, and as you say, needs to be further assessed, contextually analysed. But the rule allows for the intervention to be made.
Yes.
It's not limiting in its scope.
Yes. What it doesn't allow for is for the application to be declined.
Correct.
But it could enable a condition to be placed on the consent that would frustrate the exercise of the consent.
As we discussed yesterday.
Yes. And there could be further frustration if the road controlling authority didn't give approval for the physical works associated with the consent, any consent condition that required an improvement. Agree with that?
Sorry, Sue, that last part again. Apologies.
We've established that there could be a degree of frustration associated with the type of condition. Let's be blunt about it. A condition to put on that requires a roundabout, and so that might be tantamount to a refusal in a sense in terms of your client's position. Another potential frustration is even if there was agreement with the intervention, you'll be relying on a third party to enable that intervention to occur on state highway through the cap corridor access process and whatever other processes required. So that's another level of potential frustration.
Potentially, yes.
But presumably, if Waka Kotahi are happy with the intervention, it would be a matter of working through that process in terms of any non-RMA consents that are needed to put that in place.
I think we also covered this ground yesterday, sir, but the appropriateness of this process, the purpose of this process rather, is to establish that broader appropriateness and therefore to eliminate having the same conversation and to avoid having that same conversation in a year's time in a different context.
Yeah.
We see an example up the road of an expanded retirement village connecting to a state highway currently being built that was pretty fiercely opposed by the agency relative to the nature of interventions that they thought were required versus what were ultimately confirmed as being necessary for a project.
Ultimately, we've got to decide the appropriateness of the role, and in this case, the appropriateness of the activity status.
Yes.
And Section 32 suggests that we should have regard to the effectiveness and efficiency of the provision.
Yes.
And in that sense, putting aside efficiency in terms of let's focus on effectiveness, can you anticipate, based on the evidence that you've heard, and I'm talking about all evidence on the roading matters, any situation where a condition just won't cut the mustard, and that the only recourse is for the application to be declined?
No, I don't believe I have.
And are you relying solely on Mr. Georgeson and Ms. Morrison to come to that opinion?
No, I'm not, because if we accept the position of Waka Kotahi that in a roundabout, for instance, or other, Mr. Conley suggested other physical is necessary, then there is sufficient scope within that rule for that to be implemented.
Okay.
Whether it's ultimately followed through on, as we just talked about, is a different story.
Yes. And can we be satisfied that it's a difficult question, but I'll ask it anyway. Can we be satisfied that that is potentially the worst type of intervention, a roundabout, based on what Kotahi have suggested to date, and that there's nothing more interventionist, if you like, than a roundabout that might therefore lead Welhom to object to any consent that's granted? I know it's speculation.
Yeah, I've got visions of an underpass or something to fly over, but I don't think there would be anything more dramatic in that context than a.
That brings me to the last question, and it's a question I obviously want to put to the other planning witnesses. Heard from, well, we haven't heard from, but we've had breach of evidence from 5 experts in the transportation field. The 2 that are representing Welhom, the 2 that are representing Waka Kotahi, and Ms Fraser for the council. You've said in several cases that you're relying on the evidence of Ms Mearson and Mr Georgeson, and I understand why you would say that in relation to your evidence in chief, because you haven't had the benefit of seeing the evidence of the Waka Kotahi experts, but you've repeated that in your rebuttal statement too. And I'm just wanting to understand, it's an important question, so I've written it down. What is the basis that you have applied to your assessment of all of that evidence, all that transportation evidence, that allows you to prefer the evidence of Ms Mearson and Mr Georgeson? What can you point to, or how have you applied your assessment to lead you to the conclusion that their evidence is to be preferred over the other 3 experts?
I don't think it's my role to be evaluative of all of those. But what I have done in tandem with Mr Georgeson's is to have many a discussion around the merits of otherwise on a spectrum of options that could be. From the outset of right from due diligence stage, etc., there has been an ongoing discussion with Mr Georgeson around what might be appropriate for these. Now, I, in that context, remain of the view, in reliance on that a more fundamental reorganisation of that intersection isn't required. I haven't sought to sit in your chair of trying to evaluate the merits or otherwise of those competing positions.
Okay. Let me ask that question in a slightly different way then. Is there any policy guidance in the statutory documents that would allow you to favour the evidence of Mr Georgeson or Ms Mearson over the other 3?
Is there any policy guidance that would allow me to
favour the evidence of the 2 witnesses representing your client as opposed to the evidence of Waka Kotahi and Masterton District Council in the form of Ms Fraser? Because the reason I asked that, Mr Lewandowski, is as a signatory to the code, your duty is to assist the panel.
Correct.
And I have a different view as a decision maker that you are obliged to consider all the evidence in front of you, not just those of your client. And for example, and I'm not suggesting that this is necessary, but if there was a reason advanced by another expert that caused you to reconsider your position, I'd expect you to tell the panel.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. You're saying that you had a position in your evidence in chief based largely on the 2 expert advisors.
Correct.
you haven't changed that position, having seen the evidence of the three other experts, two for Waka Kotahi and one for the council. And I'm just wondering how you've squared away your original position in light of the additional evidence that's been received. What basis have you used to retain your original assessment? Is there any policy basis, or is, I don't know what other basis there might be?
The policy basis, so I'm just trying to put my finger on the blind, but is grounded in the safe, effective operation of that roading network. To describe it in broad terms. My view is that the provisions that are proposed provide for a range of interventions as informed by future ITA. And that the scope of those matters of control allow for what might be a range of those.
Okay.
Now, there's a spectrum of those interventions. In the absence of any of my transportation expertise, what I was trying to suggest earlier, Sarah, is I haven't sought to evaluate the particular transportation merits of this end of the spectrum or that end of the spectrum. I accept that there is a range, and it's more appropriate for those transport professionals to express views on that.
Okay. So you're saying that the answer really is in the provisions and the way in which they are formulated, and the panel needs to be satisfied that there is sufficient scope within the controlled activity to deal with what's really becoming obvious as the fundamental determinative matter of this plan change, transportation.
From my planning
Yes.
perspective, yes.
Okay. If the this is a question I'll put to the planner for Waka Kotahi. If the panel had some doubts about controlled activity and taking into account the direction of Judge Kirkpatrick in the Whakatane case, Royal Frostenberg case, where he talked about where outcomes can be achieved through a lower activity status, they should be done so. With that as context, if the panel thought there might be merit in pursuing a middle ground between controlled activity and discretionary activity, such as restricted discretionary, is that something that could be effectively drafted?
Could this be reframed as RD?
Yes. With matters of discretion instead of matters of control.
Yes, I think we talked about this briefly yesterday, Sarah. I think my answer was in the affirmative then.
Putting aside whether you consider that's necessary or not.
Yes, yes. In the abstract, could it be done? Yes, it could. And reflecting on, I guess, your comment there about the appropriate level of framing yesterday and since. I went back to the starting point, Commissioner, to National Planning Standards definition, and what that definition suggests for a retirement village is that it is principally a residential activity. So we've got a principally residential activity within a residential zone, and in my assessment there is an acceptance of that a lot of principally residential activity occurring in the residential zone. Then what is the, given that level of acceptance, particularly on a slight specific basis as well, rather than say we aren't drafting a plan at a district-wide scale, we're looking at a particular activity on a particular site. In that context, I come to a position that control is appropriate, and that appropriateness test is informed by the ability to address the effect.
Yes. And that goes to effectiveness too, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I come back to, we've got a range of matters of control that in my view cover the base. So where does the needle land? I'm comfortable with that control.
Yes.
Coming back to your question in the abstract, could it be reframed as RD? Yes, it could. It could be reframed as RD in a number of ways, including with or without a notification statement.
Yes.
Because that is the other principle, what you put up on it already, two principal issues around control cannot be declined and moved.
Yes. Would you be able to distill that answer in a section 32 context into a tabular format that gives a comparative assessment between controlled activity and some form of discretionary as some homework?
I can.
Do you understand what I'm driving at?
Yeah, I do.
And it may be that we was asked the same of Ms. Barr and Ms. St. Armand. I'm focusing solely on the section 32 test here about appropriateness with guidance from the courts on what that means in relation to effectiveness and efficiency. I guess in terms of, in this case, the risk of acting or not acting is more nuanced as well. It's not really in terms of not proceeding with the plain change or proceeding, but I guess it's the risk associated with controlled versus restricted discretionary. Yes,
David, I think we're going to need to do that anyway under 32AA if we do decide to go with something that's different to what's proposed. So to make our decision making as robust as possible, it would be great to get that position from the planners to inform us.
Yeah. Sorry if that was a little bit laboured, but I was just thinking on my feet there on that. That was all.
Okay, look, we're at 3:15. We've got two submitters waiting to go at 3 o'clock, is that right? And we've got to get through Mr. Landon Lane and ask some questions of him. So I think we're okay. I've got a couple of questions for you, Mitch. I really want to cut to the chase here. What we've got is a nexus between the expert evidence of 5 traffic, transportation, safety experts in terms of what the appropriate activity status might need to be if we approve the plan change. And that's all about, we've got at one end of the spectrum, low to medium change in effects on road safety. And we've been through the numbers this morning with your clients' experts, and they're very adamant. Their expert approach to us is we're in that real low change aspect in terms of that particular effect. We have evidence from 2 other experts for Waka Kotahi saying that the effects are to such an extent that we need to put in a significant intervention here as in terms of a roundabout. So if I'm looking at expert evidence, they're miles apart. And the planning response is bouncing off, for all the planners, 3 planners, is bouncing off that advice. And that's why I think David was talking to you about how can there be such, not only how do you reconcile that broad range of effects that are coming to us as expert evidence.
Yes.
And so that's one key issue. You'd agree that we're dealing with quite a range of effects. Yeah. Yep. Let me finish.
Absolutely.
Yep. And that is related to Waka Kotahi's valid concern that this is State Highway 2. It's their asset. They're responsible for safety and for maintaining a good, safe and efficient highway. And with a reasonable sized development, adding traffic onto that at a T intersection, they're concerned that they'd like to be involved in the detail as a party to the detail. And that comes to the third party requirement that they prefer it to be notified and then be involved. But those things, you agree, are linked. That we've got evidence saying not much effect at all. Therefore, at this hearing, we need to be satisfied that we agree with that. If we agree with the Waka Kotahi position, that it's much more extreme than that. And while we might grant the plan change, we would want to ensure in that case, if we preferred that evidence, that there be a role for Waka Kotahi in any future resource consent application. So that's where I'm at in my mind. Do you agree with the nexus?
Yeah, I agree with the range that you've outlined there. And coming back, I think, to your reference to my discussion with Commissioner Mann, at its core, simple suggestion is that the controlled activity rule provides the scope necessary to address that point.
Yes.
I acknowledge that there are other factors there around notification that obviously unsatisfactory to Kotahi. The amendment we put forward to you goes some way.
The consultation amendment
goes some way to address that, but
yes.
It stops short of notification.
Yes.
But again, that comes back to this two-stage approach of can we agree these provisions at a plan change level in a manner sufficient that stops us from having to repeat this exercise in the end.
Exactly right. And that goes to that case from Judge Kirkpatrick, Forest and Bird Whakatane, that if the effects are small and manageable, we should be adopting from an efficiency point of view, provisions that just allow people to get on with the job, rather than going through another round of process, because we see a lot of criticism of our act about that. So I would like to, for both the council and the requester, for you to particularly look at that case and give us some advice in closing. And will we be getting some legal submissions from the council?
They're going to be very great.
Yes, yes, yes. It's great. It's great that you've sat through the whole case, and you'll see how things are evolving in terms of evidence. And it does come back to, and I'm a strong advocate as a practitioner, if we've got dealing with reasonably minor effects, manageable effects, appropriate provisions, let the resource consent just get on with it through the detail, through the least obstructive process. And that's a principle that certainly Judge Kirkpatrick relayed quite well in that case we're referring to.
Paragraph 59.
Okay, well, look, that's enough for that. Look, I don't have any other questions, but your evidence is very much appreciated. The fact that you've taken the time to go through and look at the differences is good. So I think we can stand you down, and that's probably the end of your case for the moment, Daniel.
That is correct.
Thank you very much. Right, I think we should take our lay submitters now, and then we'll have a break after that. So, Megan, I've lost my timetable, so you might need to introduce people to us. Yes.
We have two lay submitters, Keith Taylor and John Dixon.
Okay, so who's first? We've got Ted. Okay, come up to the table. Look, I think if Megan just moves along, we'll just come up here and welcome. Sit down, yes. Make yourself comfortable. And seeing that Mr. Georgian's gone away, but you're a neighbour, or you live in the area?
Yes, I live in the area. I'll cover that
Okay. That's all right.
Thank you.
Right. Ted,
Okay,
yes.
thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to the submission. I'll read from here, if you don't mind. My name is Ted Taylor and I live with my wife in Sir Herbert Hart Avenue, Cashmere Oaks Estate. I made a submission of the date in 28th of September to the Welhom Development Limited application for a private plan change. The reason for the submission is that the development has the potential to have an adverse effect on our current lifestyle. I'm retired but have had a career as an environmental chemist with a period before retirement in management positions in environmental science at Great Wellington, where I held delegations relating to resource consent and planning decisions. I note this, that I'm not a planning expert, but I do have some understanding of planning matters, so I understand what you're doing.
Yes, great.
By way of clarification, I'm not unsympathetic to the proper development of retirement care centre complexes. A relative of mine is 100 years old and has for the past 8 years progressed from a service apartment to a hospital room in such a complex. And such facilities have a role in the care of the elderly, despite sometimes negative media articles. But what I'm concerned with is an ad hoc development of a landlocked site that relies on an existing subdivision development, Cashmere Oaks, and this is getting close to its one stage of completion at the moment, relying on that for the necessary infrastructure. And I'll just note here that I wrote this very brief submission before all the statements that I've seen through emails. I've had a copy of all the evidence and that sort of thing. So to some extent, a lot of these issues would have been gone through before this point in time. So this is just a general overview of how I feel about certain matters.
Thank you, Ted.
So looking at planning matters, at a rural area north of Martin and to the north of the existing Cashmere Oak subdivision has been identified as an area for future urban growth. The basis for the selection of this area is a technical document that was prepared by Marsden District Council, and that's been referred to as the MOAT report. This area has subsequently been included in the draft combined Wairarapa district plan, where it is identified as a lifestyle blocks and is bounded by State Highway 2 to the east and the Wairarapa railway line to the west. A portion of the future urban zone looked at visually is somewhat over half of that zone is the area of the site that the applicant wishes to develop. The site has no access to State Highway 2. The site is subject to the application and is effectively landlocked. The application for the proposed plan change implied that the site has been adopted as an area for urban growth and relied on this as support for the plan change. And I note one of the legal submissions from the applicant that got through email is that there was some discussion about how the MOAT report and the draft district plan should be considered in terms of a statutory document. And so then I go on to talk about if the application had not been made, or if they were in fact statutory documents, and then the development of the site as a future urban zone would include requirements, and these requirements are listed in the draft district plan. They say that structured planning or master planning for infrastructure and transport network will be required. These requirements ensure that development progresses in an integrated and cohesive way. Ad hoc subdivision and urban development, intensive rural activities, rural industries, and so on are discouraged in the future urban zone. Looked at within this context, the proposed plan change is premature in the proper development of the future urban zone. Further, it limits the ability for the balance of the future urban zone to be developed as future urban land. In essence, the wider community, the district council and the existing landowners lose the opportunity to go through a process that is or could be advantageous to all parties. The proposed plan change is very much in the nature of an ad hoc development which the draft district plan discourages. Provision of services is by way of linking into an almost completed Cashmere Oak subdivision that was not intended as a connection to the proposed site.
Ted, could you just hold there? I will want to ask you a couple of questions about where you are and your experience of the subdivision. Mark, I wonder whether you might, while we finish this discussion, get up ready to show the plans that you were showing us before. Is that possible if you want to come up and just get ready for that? We have a provision to actually get a very recent aerial photo up there, and then we can actually see where you are and you can talk to that. So carry on with traffic and we'll get that organised.
Okay, so in terms of traffic, I'm not an expert in traffic, but there's been a lot of numbers I can see with all the evidence being going backwards and forth, and I've just heard the recent discussion about traffic since I arrived this afternoon. My traffic related concern mainly relate to the proposed use of Cashmere Oaks Drive as the route of access into and out of the site. The State Highway 2 Cashmere Oaks Drive intersection only just manages to provide for safe access to the subdivision. Often there is little traffic on State Highway 2, but during school hours and work hours there is a need to wait for a safe turnout. And when I say school hours, Rathfield College is out there, and there's often around about school time, there's cars going backwards and forwards as parents go and pick up their children. And this hearsay indicates that there have been near misses. When I say hearsay, I've heard it from a person who, at least one person who has a near miss there. The applicant does not propose any real improvements to the intersection to cope with the increased flow of traffic, which will include a wide range of vehicle types compared to the existing traffic flow. For instance, care home service vehicles, staff vehicles, including night shift, medical services, etc. It is noted that traffic on State Highway 2 from the north turning into Cashmere Oaks Drive has a right-hand bay, but traffic turning from the south has limited turning provisions. In practice, slowing to turn left from State Highway 2 into Cashmere Oaks Drive results in holding up traffic that is speeding, and I do say really speeding, after the transition from the 50 km/h zone to the 100 km/h zone. And often this traffic passes the turning vehicle at speed, moving over the double yellow lines to do so. And that's a normal rather than a rare occurrence. Within Cashmere Oaks, it has been noted in the application, and I've referred to where that is, that the Corelli Place to Herbert Hart Avenue Cashmere Oaks Drive intersection has unconventional layouts. And at the moment, only 3 of the legs of that intersection are being used because the main part of the subdivision, the west side of the subdivision, hasn't been completed yet. The implication of this is that the roading, when designed, was not intended to be used for other than access for the Cashmere Oak subdivision. And in that same section, it was noted that the 4.85 metre lane widths were able to accommodate the additional traffic that could be generated by development of the site. This width will allow room for a vehicle to pass a cyclist at a slow speed, but on-street car parking would not be expected. This statement is incorrect in that on-street car parking is more than likely to occur based on this happening on the existing roads in the estate. This diminishes the ability of Cashmere Oaks Drive to accommodate the additional traffic. And some of the sections in the newer area are smaller, and so then there may be that may lead to more car parking on the newer area rather than some of the bigger sections, and more ability to park cars on the bigger sections in the existing part of the subdivision. As the site is part of a future urban zone, traffic issues should be addressed in the context of a whole future urban zone with access from there direct to State Highway 2. Overall, the applicant appears to want to defer full consideration of traffic aspects, as there are repeated references to considering such matters through the resource consent process. And I did make other matters in the submission I made to the application, but those are, I consider, less significant than what I've just referred to.
Okay.
So in conclusion, my view is that proposed plan change is not justified and the land described as a future urban zone should only be developed as a whole, subject to a structure plan that considers, among other matters, infrastructure and transport networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Mark, could you get the
About our battery here, so.
Oh, okay. So you need to
Plug it into another stuff like that.
Inside the drain onto the screen.
George has got the projector connection. Easier to sit in that spot.
But
You're welcome to plug it. Yeah.
Okay.
Just like how everybody here, but Angela has a plan with Ted's house marked on it. So Ted is this green spot here.
Okay. So could you show that to Mark, and Mark can then get his mouse to correlate? Thank you. Is the hand about in the right spot there, Ted? Yeah. Just wiggle a little bit. Okay. Okay. So you've been, how long have you actually been there? Because 4 years. It looks like those houses, a lot of them have been there, just starting to really settle down as a lovely spot to live with trees and wide roads and everything.
Nice view over the site, subject to the application. I haven't brought that up.
No, we understand that. So you're just being able to identify where you are. You will be looking. You're slightly more elevated there. Yes. Okay. I'm particularly interested in when David and I have looked around the site there. We've been, I think, one time. Yeah, both times sort of late afternoon. It was very quiet. There didn't seem to be many cars parked at all on the streets. I think the sections are quite big, aren't they? So
they are, but particularly Street.
Yes. And you've identified that it's that period, probably mid-afternoon around school time in the mornings where there's more traffic. Yes. And coming from Masterton to turn left, there's no sort of pull-off bay as you just come up there and turn left into Cashmere Oaks Drive.
There's a slight angling
off it. Yes.
Doesn't really fit a vehicle.
Okay. And you get a bit concerned when you're turning and then people are passing and going over the centre line.
It's not so much concern or that. It's just that I'm well aware that when you're coming up the hill, a lot of people are going out of town, so they rush up the hill and then off or past the turn off.
Yes.
And so they put their foot down, and what I tend to do is once I get to the 100 zone, I put my indicator on straight away to make sure that people know why I'm slowing down.
Yes.
Otherwise they get a bit itchy. Yes. But they normally see that the road's clear in front, so they just take off.
Yes.
But if somebody is coming out of Cashmere Oaks Drive, turning left, and the person that's passing me is obscured by my vehicle, they could very easily, somebody could turn when they see my indicator on, and the other car could come around and crash into it.
Okay. So look, the other question I have is that, you're really suggesting that the proposal just waits for the plan review process and the outcome of that, and then that can all be done in an integrated way?
Well, I guess in an ideal situation, it would be available.
Yes. Yes. Ted, have you been involved in plan review processes before? It sounds like you've.
In the extent that I was the manager for science,
Greater
the
Wellington.
regional council,
Yes.
and so we provided a lot of information into the plan change, particularly regional plans, with water quality, air quality, soil quality, that sort of thing. So the people that work for me provided input into that. And the original combined district plan, I had some input into the issues in relation to hazardous substances.
Okay. In terms of your chemistry, chemistry background. Yes. And I suppose you're aware that they get notified, and then probably 2 or 3 years later the decisions pop out. So do you agree it's quite a long process?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. David, did you have any other questions?
Yes, I do, Mr. Taylor. I'm interested in just following up discussion you've had with the chair regarding pulling off to make a left-hand turn coming from the Marston Township. If there was enough room within the road reserve to formalise and widen that, let's call it some form of deceleration lane, would that assist in any way for those manoeuvres?
That would definitely assist.
Yes. Would you see a need for that to be replicated on the north side of the Cashmere Oaks Drive intersection for vehicles turning left and heading north?
I don't have much experience in that way.
Okay. Is it a manoeuvre that you make confident, or do you predominantly do a right hand?
I predominantly do a right hand turn. I make 2 or 3 times a day.
Yes. Yes. And just in terms of, we heard a lot of information about gap acceptance, and this morning, I don't know if you were here.
I wasn't here.
No. What's your experience in terms of picking the gap to make the right hand turn out of the complex and going into town?
Looking to the right, you see the cars pop over the top of the hill.
Yes.
And come down. And you make the assumption that they're speeding, so putting your foot down, so you're rather cautious about what's there. And then looking to the left.
Yes.
There's, once a car comes past the Hansel's entrance, if you know where that is.
Yes, I do.
They are still going pretty fast because they're still doing 100 generally along there. So once you see a car coming from that point, you're very wary about whether you go out or not.
Yes.
So basically, I try and make sure that, and my wife does as well, that if there's cars coming either way, you would generally wait. That's from the Hansel's route to the other end. Generally wait, unless there was something about the vehicle that looked like it was going to be a slow vehicle.
Yes.
Or if they were rushing.
Have you ever taken the opportunity to pull out into that right-hand lane going back into town, that short lane that divides the left-hand lane into 2?
Well, I tend to turn out into that, but not if this vehicle's coming.
Okay.
Because it's pretty narrow there, and it's on pretty steep pull over the side there. And with cars coming so fast, that's sort of manoeuvre you do in town, but more reluctant to do it.
Yes.
At that point, because the cars can approach very, very, very quickly between Hansel's and turn off.
Yes.
If they're doing 100, it's many seconds and up there.
Yes. And I presume you agree with Mr. Georgeson that the right-hand turn into the complex coming from the north is simpler because you're only dealing with traffic in one direction. Yes. Okay. The final question I've got, Mr. Taylor, is just in terms of the fuzz zone, and you say towards the end of your evidence, as the site is part of the fuzz, traffic issues should be addressed in the context of the whole fuzz with access from there direct to State Highway 2. And I presume you mean a new access point, presumably to the north of the driveway, the Oaks Drive.
Yeah, I guess both, in, I hate to say planning context because I'm a planner, but both in the planning context and I guess it's just almost a common sense. That piece of land would be better served its own separate access and interstate highway too. And as I said, by doing that, this application for that particular part of the site, it rather limits the opportunity for the other people in that future urban zone to do anything, because are they going to be limited to access through Cashmere Oaks because if the plan change goes through, or are they going to have to form their own access on the state road too?
Right. I presume that's what you mean in your last sentence in your conclusion, that should be developed as a whole, subject to a structure plan that considers, amongst other things, infrastructure and transport networks, including a separate direct access point. Understand. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for your attendance. We appreciate coming to talk to us and give us your experience. Yes. All right. So just proceed with the next submitter. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to my submission. I haven't prepared anything fresh written, but just thought I should take the opportunity to underline, I guess, some of the issues that I saw. And I have to say, having listened to what Mr. Turner's just said, he's talking about real things. Traffic passing you when you're turning left is a major issue. And like him, it was interesting. I put my indicator on at the change of speed zone. There's traffic behind me because they do whip past and over the line. But I'm not the expert, although I actually have a solution to the problem.
So sorry, what was your name again?
John Sexton.
John Sexton, right? I don't have my list of people there, so thank you, John.
Yeah, that's good. So we have no issue with Masterton Growing. We have no issue with Masterton Growing where we live. But what we would like to see is that the development follows the nature of what's already there. And I mean, we're all good at NIMBYism. And I have to say I prefer the green paddocks that we enjoy at the moment rather than some urban development. But the reality is it's going to come sooner or later, and that's fine. But let's do it decently and in order. I'm not sure whether I should be encouraged or discouraged by the fact that actually the Crown is the major shareholder in this development. If you trace back through who owns Welhom, because in one sense they could have buckets of money because they could print it to actually do the thing properly, or commercial instincts take over and you follow the plan and you just replicate what you've got elsewhere, irrespective of what's appropriate for the site and where you're going. So specifically, we're probably slightly unique in that our house is on the corner of lot 36, which is the right-of-way, that is at the moment the legal access to the block of land that's subject to discussion.
So that road, the name of the road is?
Well, we live in Roger and
Roger, yes. So we've driven down to the end of that.
Yeah, and as you go down, we're in the little lane that runs off the end of the cul-de-sac.
Okay, so just we've got the mouse showing on the.
Yeah, no, we're there. We're the one. Yeah. And we've talked with Roger Southey, who's currently owns the property, and absolutely accept his assurances that the right-of-way lot 36 is not going to become the major highway. My dealings with Roger, I have no doubt what he's telling me at all. However, he could fall off his horse. We could be dealing with someone different, and so one of our submissions was that actually as part of tidying this up, we need to be quite clear that the right of way is not the access to the property. I guess it's interesting because Welhom themselves on their website talking about this development talk about the prestigious premium subdivision that the village will have access through, and the type and the style of the development is important, and we would like to ensure that that is continued. And so I guess one of my concerns, or one of our concerns, is the main block, which will be high, we're told, and will be a block on the landscape. And I have to disagree. Well, with respect to Mr. Bentley's evidence, he's saying that there's not many people will be affected, and that's literally true. But in our case, we will obviously see it. And we don't believe there's a need for multi-storey buildings in Masterton. Arvida at Lansdowne Park is the only village that has some two-storey building, and that is probably directed by the contours of the land. So our very strong preference is that, in keeping with the Cashmere Oak subdivision, the whole thing is built on a single level. And there's precedence for that. Just down the road here, the public hospital's all single. This is Masterton, not Auckland or Wellington. And so there's plenty of land, and the sites, the rest home site's going to be, village site's going to be 9 hectares, so why go up? The section sizes, there's obviously going to be some sections there, and I totally understand that in terms of what the Masterton district plan is, that you can have a 350 square metre section, I think. I think the average size section in the Cashmere Oak subdivision is around 1,000. And we would certainly want to see that maintained. I'm not saying that everyone has to be 1,000, but we certainly don't want some sort of commercialisation of the residential area with people crammed in. And that really is all I need to say, I think.
Thank you, John. I just had a comment about the access of that right of way at the end of where you live. The way that, as I understand it, the way the plan change has been proposed is if the development, the access is proposed through the bottom, I think, just show us there on the through that where the mouse is coming.
So
through here.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's a outline plan attached to it that if that's not actually undertaken, you have to go up to a much higher consent status and have to be notified, and the whole thing sort of changes from there. So just to make you aware that there is a protection there, that if the access was coming anywhere else, that would move the process up a level, and there'd be notification and full disclosure then. So
in other words, it doesn't rely on Mr. Southey's assurances.
No, that's fine. There's no doubt with Mr. Southey's assurances at all.
Yeah.
I accept 100%.
Yes.
It's good to have these things sorted
Yes.
on a legal basis.
yes,
and I just thought it was appropriate to remind you that that's the expectation.
yes.
Mr. Lewandowski dealt with that at his paragraph 921. If you want to have a look at it at your leisure.
All right.
Yeah, in his statement.
Okay, thank you.
David, did you have any questions for John?
I guess we covered the access. The only other thing, I guess, was the 14-metre height for the retirement village in that prescribed area. And you've told us you disagree with Mr. Bentley. Mr. Lewandowski drawn to our attention that the district plan currently, and I presume he's referring to the rural zoning, allows for non-residential buildings to be built up to 15 metres on that site. Does that?
That's slightly disingenuous because there's a big difference between rural buildings and high density and residential hospital care facilities.
Sure.
So yeah, if somebody wants to put some grain silos or a shearing shed there, that's, you know, you've still got plenty of land around it.
Yes.
Whereas what we're looking at here, and we will see a good bit of it, is the, you know, it's all going to be housed. I understand the planting and all that will help.
Yes.
I'm not averse to the project.
No. You'll be looking down.
Slightly down.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
If we really don't like it, we can eventually plant.
Yes. And that brings me to another question. There's been some disagreement about the need for planting along various boundaries of the application site. The applicant is proposing some planting 1 to 2 metres on the northern boundary.
I read that.
The landscape architect for the council has recommended that there should be some planting along the southern boundary too, which would affect your views north. Do you have any view on the desirability or otherwise of having planting along the southern boundary?
I think planting, well, there's already some planting there.
Yes.
So there's a.
I'm talking about additional screen.
I don't have a problem with that.
You don't have a problem with additional planting? No. Might it affect your views?
Yes.
Yes.
I'd rather see trees than buildings.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming along. It's always great flavour to these hearings to have people that are actually living there and experience these matters. So really appreciate your submission and coming and talking to us.
Yeah, fine. If anyone wants to come up and have a look at what we'll be looking at,
yes.
Very welcome.
Yeah. We're a little bit reluctant to go along that laneway because we thought we were entering private property. So
we'll give you an invitation.
That's great. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mark, for doing that. That's very helpful. Look, it's let's take a 5-minute comfort stop. Grab a glass of water or a cup of tea, and let's come back 5 past 4. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there is a fly. It's right on the camera. It's obviously very warm.
And so is that Mr. Landon Lane?
Yes.
Next.
Yes.
Thank you.